स्वागत है नेहरू डायलॉग्स और ओरिएंट ब्लैकस्वान की तरफ से। आप सबको मालूम है कि आज हम यहाँ इकट्ठा हैं अपने मित्र देबादित्य भट्टाचार्य की नई किताब द इंडियन यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ क्रिटिकल हिस्ट्री इसके जारी करने के मौके पर और इस किताब पर एक चर्चा के बहाने। देबादित्य को आप सारे लोग जानते हैं, यहाँ जो बैठे हुए हैं वे सब साहित्य पढ़ाते हैं, और लेकिन उनकी रुचि शिक्षा और विश्वविद्यालयों में शुरू से रही है। उनकी 2 संपादित किताबें यूनिवर्सिटी पर पहले आ चुकी हैं। यह किताब जब आई तो इसके शीर्षक ने हमें काफ़ी आकर्षित किया, यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ क्रिटिकल हिस्ट्री, क्योंकि इंडियन कहते ही हमारे दिमाग में एक प्राचीन भारत की तस्वीर आती है कि इंडियन यूनिवर्सिटी रही होगी और अब कुछ और है। लेकिन देबादित्य, जैसा आप चर्चा में देखेंगे, इस किताब में कुछ और करने जा रहे हैं और वे इस पर सवाल करते हैं कि जिन्हें दरअसल इंडियन यूनिवर्सिटी कहा जाता है, आप उन्हें यूनिवर्सिटी के हिसाब से यूनिवर्सिटी कहेंगे भी या नहीं कहेंगे, यानी तक्षशिला या नालंदा, इस तरह की यूनिवर्सिटीज़ को। मुझे याद है कि प्रोफेसर अमर्त्य सेन ने जब नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय की शुरुआत हुई तो उन्होंने एक बात कही जो मुझे बहुत अजीब लगी। उन्होंने कहा कि मैं बचपन से नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय के पुनरुद्धार की बात सोचता था कि नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय का पुनरुद्धार किया जा सकता है। तो मुझे लगा कि इस पर किसी वक्त अमर्त्य सेन से बात करना बहुत ज़रूरी है कि क्या नालंदा का पुनरुद्धार किया जा सकता है और क्या किया जाना चाहिए। तो ये किताब शुरू में वो प्रश्न करती है और उसके बाद एक लंबी दूरी तय करती है, जो दूरी अंग्रेजी हिंदुस्तान की है, जिसमें शिक्षा के इदारे, शिक्षा के संस्थान किन रूपों में मौजूद थे, उनका एक सर्वेक्षण, उनकी पड़ताल और उनका विश्लेषण, और उसके बाद विश्वविद्यालय की तरह कैसे विकसित होते हैं इसका विश्लेषण। और यह आज तक यह किताब आती है, इस क्षण तक। यानी भारत की शिक्षा में जो सबसे लोकप्रिय शब्द है NEP, ये इस किताब में आपको बार बार दिखाई पड़ेगा। और जैसा वादा किया गया है किताब में कि आलोचनात्मक ढंग से उस पर बात की जा रही है, तो मैं इस किताब पर कोई टिप्पणी नहीं करूंगा, क्योंकि इसके लिए हमारे पास से 4 वक्ता मौजूद हैं देबादित्य, और तरीका ये रहेगा कि देबादित्य भट्टाचार्य जो किताब के लेखक हैं सबसे पहले इस किताब के बारे में बताएंगे और वे सबसे कम बोलेंगे, ये हम लोगों के भी वादा हुआ है। मेरा काम सिर्फ वक्त घड़ी देखना है और इशारा कर देना है कि अब बस। उसके बाद हम अनुरोध करेंगे इतिहासकार तनिका सरकार से कि वे अपनी बात करें, और फिर साहित्य की अध्यापक IIT में सिमोना साहनी से कि वे अपनी बात कहें, और फिर राजनीति विज्ञानी प्रोफेसर जोया हसन से कि वे अपनी बात कहें, और फिर आप सारे लोग सवाल करेंगे सवालों की तरह। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। सबसे पहले जो एक कर्म कांड है वो हम करेंगे, यानी आपको हम किताब का दर्शन कराएंगे। प्लीज आप सारे लोग खड़े हो जाएं। तो आपने किताब का दर्शन कर लिया। प्रकाशक ये चाहते हैं कि इसको आप खरीद भी लें।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अपूर्वानंद जी को, जो दोस्त है और दोस्त के साथ साथ जो कंटिन्यूसली इंस्पायर करते रहते हैं हम सबको। तो आज के इस जमाने में, इस माहौल में, ये जो खौफ है जिसके अंदर हम लोग आज भी यूनिवर्सिटी को लेके चिंता करने की कोशिश करते हैं या फिर यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाने की कोशिश करते हैं, बातचीत वाद संवाद चलाने की कोशिश करते हैं, उसके लिए I think Apurvanand ji is an inspiration, and I have to thank him for making this possible for all of us to come here together. And at the same time, I should also thank the three scholars who are here, who have agreed to be part of this panel and who have agreed to speak on my work, given the fact that these are people who I have grown up reading the work of. So it's a great privilege and pleasure for me to have them as commentators on my work, and I'm indeed deeply indebted to them. So as you've been already told that I have to really keep my piece short. So, and I would rather not say much and have others speak about the work and the let's say the aporias of the work, as it were. So what I'll probably just touch upon and then pass on the mic to the panelists here is the immediate provocation, right, behind writing this book. And that, I think, has already been spoken by Apurvanand, but I think it's important for us to kind of return to it over and over again. The immediate provocation for me to start thinking about writing a history, and not just a history, but a critical history, as I call it, of the Indian university was the NEP 2020. Right? So I thought that the NEP 2020 is what actually makes irony the province of policy making and policy thinking. I think it's a masterclass in irony, right? And I'm quite fascinated by it, even as it is an assault in terms of the intention that underlies that irony, right? So even as one is constantly attacked by the intention underlying the script of that policy, right? So one cannot but help being fascinated by the use of irony that this policy document makes. It says something and means something completely different, right? And you have this document of the NEP 2020 waxing eloquent about increasing public spending on higher education, and then going out and saying that the worst problem or the biggest problem with Indian higher education is that we have too many institutions and we need to dramatically cut down on the number of institutions, right? So that's like the biggest irony. It says that we have to double our gross enrollment ratio, which is of course the favorite buzzword, right? So where enrollment is counted without accounting for dropouts, right? So where there's this tremendous fetish around gross enrollment ratio, and which says that we have to double our GER by quartering the number of institutions, right? And then it talks about increased public spending. Then you have a document which, for the first time in the history of independent India, actually acknowledges the failure of the economic justification of higher education, which actually goes out and acknowledges the fact that there are no jobs. Then what do? Then higher education should go out and train us for our first job, our second job, our third job, and for infinite jobs in the future. So basically it goes out and legitimizes the gig economy and says that higher education must actually try and cue us into the gig economy, into a job loss economy, as it were, right? So the fancy name that it gives to this kind of a training for first job to infinite jobs, right, so is multidisciplinarity, right? So it calls it multidisciplinary education, and multidisciplinary education is just a euphemism in the policy text for multi-skilling and multitasking a workforce that eventually, right, so is going into a recessionary economy. Right, so and then you have this economy going out and waxing eloquent about liberal education, right? So while saying that liberal education is bringing back the Chaucer Kala, right? So liberal education is something that we need to glorify the goldenness of India's Vedic past, right? So, and liberal education is what must be finally geared towards the fourth industrial revolution, right? So that is the subtext of irony that really made me think of something astonishing that this work of policy art manages, which is, I think, a deep consciousness of the fault lines of India's university history. Right? So this policy comes with an awareness of the fault lines that underlie the history of the Indian university. And it is that history that I wanted to return to. I wanted to return to a self-critique of the Indian university, rather than just a liberal hankering for the for let's say the elite metropolitan university as we have it, right? Rather than just that kind of a nostalgic return to the idea of a university as it were, I wanted us to also start the historicizing effort, right, from an acute self-critical awareness of the university's fraughtness, of the university's, what I call the fraught publicness of the Indian university. So that is largely the question that I wanted to embark on this book from, and I thought that therefore the question that I must ask myself is, what makes the Indian university worthy of a history? Right? What really makes it a creature of history? What is it about the Indian university that accords it an Indianness as well as a universityness? Right? So what accounts for the Indian and the universitarian character of the Indian university? And I wanted to seek that middle ground, which for me grants it both the Indian character and the universitarian character, not our elaborate fantasies of Nalanda and Takshila, which I go out and bust through some bit of historical archiving, cannot be called university ideas at all, right? So, but I tried to stumble against that middle ground, and that middle ground was for me the register of publicness. So for me, this history, this critical history, is a history of the publicness, and not just a haloed publicness, but a fraught publicness of the Indian university, right? And that, I thought, will probably make us aware of the fault lines of this history, rather than just uncritically return to it and say that, oh, we want to go back to even the Nehruvian university. So that's largely the framing that pushed me into this project, that kind of provoked me into doing this. So I'll just stop here. I think I've kept my vada, right? So I'll just, Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you, Debaditya, for having me here. The theme of the book intrigued me. Truly, we may spend a lifetime teaching at universities and we have a fair idea about our own institutional space. But we rarely, if at all, certainly I didn't, reflect on what the concept of the university in an Indian context has been, is now, and may become in the future, which is what Debaditya does. So I congratulate him for this very important work, and Orient BlackSwan for publishing it. He draws upon a very wide range of theoretical concepts. The book is both thoughtful and provocative. It is also a great read, very pleasurable read. And it is especially welcome in the light of, or should I say in the darkness of, the new education policy of 2020. The new education policy had long forebears. I won't go into that now. Time being limited, I will mention just a few points that I particularly found valuable. And there are many more which I can't go into. But I'll also ask a couple of questions as I go along. So Debaditya provides a very impressive history of the modern university education, from the colonial times to the present. Actually, the highly admirable, very well-researched chapter on ancient universities goes much, much further back. This is a long and crowded time span, and I think he presents it through two prisms. The first is predominantly historical. So he uncovers the instrumental nature of the colonial university And then he presents an extended history of anti-colonial movements of various tribes, nationalist, revolutionary, left-wing. The second prism provides a study of policy frameworks particularly, starting with the Radhakrishnan Committee report of 1948, finishing off with NEP. And he parses state strategies meticulously to identify the changes and breaks within over this long time span. And he reads the language of the policy frameworks very carefully and brings up, what is what is rhetoric, what is doublespeak, what is dishonest about them. A very useful context for us to think about our present situation and predicament. I'm very glad that in the process he rejects two standard assumptions. One, and that is actually to be found among a number of critics of the new education policy too, that we had a splendid, inimitable university system in the ancient past. Second, that past should be the model for the present institutions. In other words, we should thoroughly, quote-unquote, Hinduize the present system in the name of an imagined ancient splendor, and then turn it around to serve the ideological interests of the present ruling class. Debaditya challenges both assumptions with two marvelous bits of myth-busting. First, he reveals the limits of the ancient sites of advanced learning, as he said right now, so that he also exposes the way statistical data is now manipulated and falsified, so that the present regime may claim that it has worked a miracle of inclusiveness in terms of Dalit and women's empowerment. The introductory chapter begins with Rabindranath on the idea of the national university. As he reminds us, Tagore opposed colonial pedagogy, and this is an important point to make, not because it originated in a foreign context, but because it lacked any organic connection with the material life world and socio-cultural experiences of the Indian public. So colonial is not the main problem here. It is ignorance. It is insensitivity. And the post-colonial governments have not actually shown kind of compensatory sensitivity or knowledge about what education should be. Debaditya clarifies and extends the concept of publicness of education, which should be sustained by and also sustain the immediate local environment. As he puts it, a cooperative model co-partnered by the public and the university. And there is yet another remarkable thing about Tagore's ideas about the university, Vishwabharati, that sat at odds with most nationalists of his time. And it's important to recall today, Tagore was an internationalist in an intellectual, cultural, and political sense, keen to be grounded in and to ground his university in global culture and ideas, as well as in Indian ones. The Gandhi-Tagore debates are significant in this context, and he had much in common with Nehru here. This is important to recall today when the entire national education agenda is geared towards keeping the world out of Indian thinking, to confine the universities to navel-gazing and self-congratulation. I think there could be, I may be totally mistaken, a slight problem about the publicness, if I have understood it correctly. It assumes an organic connection with and reliance on the immediate community environment. And it's certainly an attractive and important idea. But given the conditions here, would it not run the risk of mortgaging the university to majoritarian community perspectives? Any public in our country, be it urban or rural, has every chance of being deeply conservative, ethnocentric. And publics are heterogeneous and cannot have a singular educational perspective. So maybe I misunderstood what exactly you... A few words about the historical context, and there are minor sort of puzzles there. While discussing the restrictive nature of colonial education, Debaditya somehow slips entirely away from the university, forgets it for the time being, to focus on the school or pathshala, from pre-colonial times and carried over to some extent into colonial times as well. He uses Adams' excellent work on Bengal. The pathshalas were, as he says, multicast and inclusive, but they taught basic literacy and numeracy to elementary and primary level students alone. They did not provide reading matter to students, the stress being to develop their writing skills and just their writing skills, as Paramesh Acharya's study has shown. So those two sides of education, pathshala and university, are very different and non-commensurate. The pre-colonial analog to the modern university should be the Brahmanical Tol Chatushpathis and the madrasas, and where the medium of instruction was either Sanskrit or Arabic Persian. Courses were largely scripture-centered. Tol Chatushpathis, moreover, admitted high caste students alone. So that was one minor puzzle. And also the other one is that I didn't understand, or I was a little befuddled, why was there such a long and extended excursus into various strands of anti-colonial movements? How does that fit into his own scheme? The history of freedom movements is interesting, certainly, and he puts it very well, but there is no discussion of the educational ideas of the different strands, if indeed there were any. But Gandhi did have his own vision, and maybe he could have said something about it. His commission by commission chronology of the post-colonial government is exceedingly instructive, and I learned a great deal. Each, he shows, concludes, has ignored the problems of caste and class, despite the rhetoric of fairness, and that contradiction he brings out very well. Now, this is largely true, but it may also create a slightly unfair impression of sameness, of unchanging insensitivity to social injustice. It was there, but maybe it is going a little too far. We do have to remember that educational reservation for Adivasi Dalits was a stupendous step for the immediate post-independence period. Even several decades later, there was just mayhem over the Mandal Commission recommendations. So in the 1940s and 50s, the opposition would have been far more intense and bitter. So it was no mean feat to carry the idea of reservations through. Later too, notwithstanding the outrage, the violence, the suicides over the Mandal Commission recommendations, OBC reservations did get implemented. And why and how? Surely these were somewhat meaningful changes in university caste profiles, even if they were merely incremental gains. And even if, and I find that was a serious lapse on the part of the governments of the day, they did not think it necessary to increase the numbers of universities and the intake of students at the same time and in the corresponding measure. And Debaditya is, of course, 100% right about the deliberate exclusion and the persistent exclusion of the religious minorities from the remit of reservations, which runs from the Nehruvian times to now. We commonly define publicness in opposition to private investment, state-funded universities as against private ones, the latter coming out of corporate funding and ultimately dependent on corporate directives and interests. Our post-colonial public universities, like their colonial predecessor, were funded by the state, no doubt, and that had its problems. But they did not significantly, or at least I think so, did not significantly intrude upon the different institutions' pedagogical and curricular arrangements for many decades after independence. Those matters were, by and large, for better or for worse, left to the decisions of the individual academic communities. By and large, too, at least some universities did admit or did begin to admit subaltern social segments. JNU, it is a metropolitan university, but it had a very remarkably inclusive admission policy. In 2017-18, I was rather surprised, pleasantly surprised to find that working class children of factory workers were studying at MA levels in Delhi University. Now, this is not, of course, the situation everywhere, but some dents, are noticeable. Of course, he's absolutely right about gross caste inequality and especially inequality among religious communities, but the fractures, however small, cannot be perhaps forgotten. Debaditya focuses in the second part on plans and recommendations. There is a gap between the theory, which he elaborates meticulously, and actual university practices on the ground, and there I think the experience of metropolitan universities and state universities might be different. So I have state universities were free to develop on their own as they liked for a long time. But despite that, and that is my question also, in West Bengal, for instance, where the left front had enjoyed an unprecedented sixth term in office continuously, caste was systematically denied as an important factor in education or in social life. In Tripura, Adivasis, by all accounts, were quite marginalized. And moreover, did our left or other political parties, apart from those who ruled at the center or at the states, ever devise a distinctly different way of, a distinctly different educational agenda? Or did they see the universities as a real site for possible social and intellectual transformation? Did they work towards it? Or did they see them as a site for patronage distribution and electoral mobilization? So that's one question I have. It is perhaps necessary, this is a kind of my constant refrain, necessary to consider the RSS agenda for higher education at some length. As I have written repeatedly, RSS systematically developed elaborate plans for universities and research institutions from the 1970s and formulated its own pedagogical methods with utmost care. Since 2014, they have occupied the commanding heights in the world of education at all levels, and their Hinduizing or Hindutvaizing methods were clearly revealed, for instance, during the orientation courses for college teachers at Delhi University in 2017-18. MEP is partly, if not substantially, shaped by its perspective. It follows that perspective. Right now, the syllabi and the question papers for the undergraduate value-added courses undoubtedly reveal large Hindutva footprints and how to purify the Havan space and how to, see the body, human body through Ayurvedic lens and so on and so forth. He has talked about that. Religious nationalism, I think, offers the sacred glue that binds neoliberal privatization of higher education with an overriding ethnocentric pedagogy. But Debaditya has amassed massive material and keen insights. It is unfair to ask a single monograph to do anything more, and mine are but minor quibbles, or a request for yet another book on this very important theme. I must express the most profound gratitude for his very perceptive and sophisticated critique of NAP intentions and calculations. I have long been wondering what was the point of totally dumbing down higher education, rendering into such an absurdity, such an impossibility. He uncovers the hidden logic, the sinister intelligence behind the seeming insanity, and he just talked about that. And here he busts a third myth, and a very fashionable one too. NEP, as he shows, fragments the university as an academic site, a site for intellectual, critical subject formation. It ruptures the integrity of academic disciplines, and it does all this in the name of a reckless but fashionable multidisciplinarity. So the same student might have a range beginning from economics to pasta cooking to Ayurvedas on the same plate. So this evaporates disciplinary rigor in a play of insubstantial multiples of university-offered assets or degrees in a wide range of courses. This, he says, is done to insulate the student against an anticipated and deepening crisis in jobs, or rather to make her hope that the multiples will provide multiple opportunities for multiple job opportunities in various sectors in a vanishing job market. I thank Debaditya for teaching me so much, and I hope the book will be widely read and seriously discussed. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So let me first extend my very, very warm congratulations to Debaditya for writing such a comprehensive, very well-researched and extremely thought-provoking book. So let me also make two confessions before I get on with the note. The first is that I have to apologize that I could not read the book as carefully as it deserves. And this is not to make excuses, but I think it's partly because we seem to have reached a stage in the life of the Indian university where it seems that time to read and think has to be, as it were, stolen. Small pockets have to be freed up every day from the constant demands of the institution, committees, meetings, household care, almost as if reading and thinking were accidental and not essential to the work we are engaged in. I've often thought it strange that reading hours are not part of the daily curriculum of any university I know. Second confession, I'm not the best discussant for this book. Now, when Debaditya invited me, I agreed because the topic is so fascinating and, of course, I have an interest in education. But I do think that someone with a greater familiarity with some of the historical debates that he discusses, and also a familiarity with some of the struggles, sometimes very violent struggles, that have taken place in the Indian university, in the context of the Indian university for the past few decades, would have been a more suitable interlocutor. But I'm here, so I'll be the foil to Tanika and Zoya here. Now, the question that I think the book consistently pursues across its 6 chapters can perhaps be summarized thus. And here it resonates with something that Tanika has already said. How should we understand the public nature of the public university? Or in other words, who is the public that is addressed, summoned, or sought to be educated by this university? And I think what the book reveals is a set of tensions around this concept of the public. Now, these tensions are most clearly manifested in a series of disavowals that Debaditya traces through his meticulous readings of reports and policy documents from the 19th century till our contemporary moment. The first of these disavowals is the disavowal of caste. And not only of caste, but of a subject that cannot be easily accommodated within the Hindu nationalist imaginary. So caste and religion. Hence, as far as administrators and even educationists are concerned, various turns during the history of the 20th century to inclusivity, to opening access, to invocations of equality and so on, never really managed to erode the abiding sense of university administrations. I think this is something that the book shows very well, that all of these turns to inclusivity never managed to erode the sense that in all these endeavors, something pure, something that were as if detachable from worldly conditions, namely merit, was always in danger of being compromised. So what he shows is that even though there are many places where certain policies are enacted, and as Tanika said, I mean, that's very important that these policies were enacted, they had some real effects. But they never managed to, in practice or in theory, get away from the idea that in some way a certain idea of merit was being compromised, that there was something that was being hijacked. So, for example, discussing the report of the Education Commission of 1964-66, which we know as the Kothari Commission, Debaditya argues that the Commission's perception of the workings of social privilege, so he does acknowledge that it made some gains in this arena, but its perception did not actually result in any concrete ways of addressing caste or religious exclusion. As he writes, and I quote, "The search for policy methods of addressing caste seamlessly assumed a wiping out of the historical effects of differentiation performed by caste and religious stratifications of a rights framework." Now, it is in reading the actual recommendations that the attachment, this kind of inability to give up the idea of merit as a kind of fortified bastion emerges most distinctly. There are two related moves here that Debaditya traces. While the Commission laudably insisted on an eventual abolition of tuition fees at all levels of education, it nevertheless went on to cite the excuse of resource scarcity to privilege free schooling over free colleges. So at the end, although it says, yes, tuition should be free, but we don't have enough resources, so therefore let's stick to free tuition for schools, not for colleges. So Debaditya does not dwell on this distinction, and in fact, I also wanted to say something about the Adam report and the turn to the Pathshalas, but I think since Tanika has already discussed that, I'll let that go. So Debaditya doesn't dwell on this, but the implication is clear. While access to primary education may be expanded, fears about tampering with higher education remain prominent. Now, when reading these sections, I was reminded of two related and I think very important arguments. Some of you may recall that W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903, in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, passionately insists that it is precisely institutions of higher learning and not mere literacy or workmanship that the Negro, that's the term that he's using, that the Negro most urgently requires. And you know, he's arguing here not only against what we would call white Southerners or white supremacists. He's also arguing with fellow African Americans like Booker T. Washington, people who really thought that first you must have primary education. So he argues that this he argues is the only way not to create what he calls a turbulent black proletariat. He says if we only provide primary education, this is what we'll end up with, a kind of a seething and turbulent black proletariat condemned to its proletarian condition without any avenue of escape. So that's Du Bois in 1903. Now the second thinker of whom I was reminded is of course Ambedkar. And here I have to also, I was just puzzled that Ambedkar did not figure more prominently in the book. Again, I understand that every book has its constraints, but this is something that perhaps Debaditya can talk a little bit about. Now, I'm going to read out shortly a brief passage from Ambedkar's 1947 message to a society called the Maratha Mandir, which was an educational society. So, but before I do that, let me cite an extraordinary passage that Debaditya writes, that Debaditya quotes from the Kothari report. The Kothari report, this is from the section where a proposal is made for entities called major universities, those that like the IITs for a very long time of their existence, and I of course teach in one, would, quote, foster a climate of intense academic exchange in the absence of the infecting touch of mediocrity. Okay, now this is Debaditya, this is not the report. But let me just read you a little passage from the report which will, I think, then set the stage for Ambedkar. So the report says, we must recognize that pursuit of excellence implies and requires a discriminatory approach, and that to provide equal resources to all, irrespective of the quality of their performance and potentiality for growth, merely promotes mediocrity. We are trying to establish a democratic social order in our country, and obviously a democracy cannot flourish unless it has at its disposal the services of a highly trained and powerfully motivated, educated class. And then it goes on. Now, a democracy, the report says, can't flourish until it has at its disposal this trained and politically motivated, educated class. In his message to the Maratha Mandal in March 1947, Ambedkar puts it much more bluntly. And let me cite this. The Marathas, he says, like all backward communities, must seek a controlling influence on the state. And this will only happen through higher education. So we're seeing the other side of this argument, right? What is being left out of the Kothari Commission. So Ambedkar is also making a push for higher education, but he's putting it very bluntly. It's only through this that you can actually have some influence over the state. If Brahmins control the state today, this is what he writes, it's because they are the most highly educated. The task of the Maratha Mandal should not be to support government initiatives that speak only of primary education. Such initiatives, he says, leave me cold. Those are his words. Far, and again I quote, far from creating any enthusiasm in me, these state initiatives for free primary education, I look upon them as a snare. Now, it is striking that both Du Bois and Ambedkar are unambiguously clear in this regard. It is not primary or even secondary education that is the real question for those at the margins of the socio-economic frame, but rather, indeed, precisely university education. Given the book's focus, so, I couldn't help wondering why Ambedkar's thoughts on education didn't figure in it more prominently. Now, another tension that the book traces, closely connected to its salient concern with publicness and access, is around the idea of the political. Though Debaditya documents several places where a fear of the politicized student, and even more so of an educated, politicized, and vocal public, may be seen as guiding government policy. This anxiety emerges most vividly in Debaditya's account of pre-independence youth movements in chapter 3. Whereas in the immediate pre-independence movement, in the immediate pre-independence period, during and after the Second World War, a kind of amalgam of nationalist and communist sensibilities could find public space, this space then rapidly dwindled. So just as a side note, I think one place where this is discussed in really great ethnographic detail is Yashpal's last novel. As some of you know, I've been working on Yashpal for many years now, Meri Teri Uski Baat, which gives a very, very comprehensive, detailed account of how these student groups were operating in UP, in various universities at that time, and perhaps that's something you could take a look at, just to flesh out some of this. So what he's saying is, at that time there was this amalgam between the communists and the nationalists, so the Congress really, but then it dwindled out, and instead he says, and I'm going to cite again a little bit from the book, he says, the familiar tropes of a nationalism committed to culture and society versus a communism committed to a party politics was largely left undisturbed despite historical memory. But later on, it is hardly astonishing that around the eve of India's independence, none other than the would-be Prime Minister in Nehru, with his durable connections with party politics of both the Congress and Socialist Unionist varieties, diagnoses the defects of the Indian student movements in the following passage. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from Nehru's passage. He says, to offer political leadership to the country is not the function of the student movement in India. They cannot recommend any action to the country. Of course, this does not apply to conditions that are created in a time of crisis, because the Congress had used the student movement in a time of crisis. Students, instead of taking active part in politics, should go to the villages, and so on. The student movements all over the world are of a non-political nature, whereas in India they are linked to politics. This is the main defect with the students' movement in India. So that's Nehru's judgment. Let me conclude by making just a couple of remarks about the questions opened by this very provocative passage. First, the basic question that not only this passage, but I think the entire book asks is about money. Who can possibly fund an education worthy of the name? This is a question that the book poses in many contexts. And basically, Debaditya can correct me, what we find is that there is no reasonably satisfying answer to this very fundamental question. If it is the community, then education runs the risk of being subject to majoritarian and often conservative social beliefs. If we say the community itself or local communities or however you might put it should fund education. If corporations, as we see now, then it is subject to the demands and even more significantly to the underlying logic of the market. And that's also something that is very well demonstrated in the last chapter. And if it is the nation, then it is subject to nationalist fantasies that are themselves financed and underwritten, as it were, by a whole range of masters. Now, this is something we've known for a very long time. For example, just to give one quick example, in his 1916 book, so we are right in the middle of the First World War, Democracy and Education, John Dewey lays it out with admirable clarity when he asks, how is it even possible for an educational system to be conducted by a national state and yet the full social ends of the educative process not to be restrained, constrained, and corrupted? Okay. So he's saying education aspires to a kind of internationalism, but as long as it is in the hands of the nation states, which are always hostile towards each other and always, trying to promote their own interests, this is not going to happen. Now, second, and this is the last thing, the relation between politics and education. It is by now a truism to say that all education is political. But what we find in Nehru's worry about student politics is not merely a worry that students might neglect their true vocation, namely study, or that universities might become places of indoctrination. Instead, I think it's something more. And I think this is what Debaditya also suggests in his book. If the figure of the student must be kept resolutely out of the realm of political thought and action, it may be because this figure of somebody young, yet to be educated, and hence subject to authority, discipline, and moral correction, this figure also functions as the fantasy figure of the ideal citizen of a democracy that was never meant to be one. So it's actually the figure of this kind of student that is the fantasy of the citizen of a democracy, which actually was never really imagined as being a democracy. It's always to come, as others have said. In other words, the problem in fact lies with how the subject of democracy itself can be imagined. What is abundantly clear is that the relation between the two, education and democracy, is fraught by its very nature. To settle this question would be to mistake what is of crucial significance to both. It's not something, I think, that can simply be settled. We happen to live in times when both the possibility and the paralysis of this relation confronts us daily. Across the world, though unfortunately not very often in India, those who have spoken out most forcefully, most publicly, and most consistently against the genocide in Palestine have been students, sometimes even school students. They have shown us that in spite of their education, in spite of the complete abdication of responsibility by their institutions, they have somehow become citizens of the world and not just of their own countries. And yet, and this is the paralyzing aspect, and I'm sorry that I have to conclude on this note of despair, despite their courageous actions, which have often resulted in extremely harsh and punitive measures, nothing has really changed. The genocide continues day after day as though no speech, no action of the citizens of the world could have the slightest impact on the military prowess and political will of powerful states. Today, it is from this space, a space that forces us to come to terms with the ineffectual nature of democratic political speech and action, that we must again begin to think the publicness and worldliness of the university. And to do that, we should read and think with Debaditya's very serious book.
Thank you. Let me also start by congratulating Debaditya for writing this absolutely wonderful book. It's really an outstanding piece of work. And thank you also for the opportunity to be part of this panel to discuss your very timely and, as Tanika rightly said at the outset, a very provocative book, but also a very, deeply researched book as well. Now, I think this excellent book raises some very urgent. This excellent book raises some very urgent and significant questions about the current state of higher education in India. It closely examines the historical transformations, the shifting policy frameworks, and the increasing political encroachments, although I would have expected more discussion of them. So, an increasing political encroachments that have shaped and continue to shape our university system. Now, my take on the book is political. It's neither theoretical or historical. In fact, I will focus on some of the larger concerns regarding higher education and universities that arise from this admirable account. Now, this book offers a periodized account of the development of the Indian university system, the university infrastructure, tracing its evolution essentially from the colonial era institutions to the establishment of state universities in post-independence India. I think the book's strength lies in its very incisive critique of key policy frameworks, most notably the National Education Policy of 2020, the credit banking systems, the privatization strategies, and the increasing bureaucratization of academic labor. But in the end, it is a highly theorized critique of contemporary educational policy situated within a broader analysis of the neoliberal turn in India's economic and educational landscape, rather than an account of the state and practice of universities. Now, while the work is intellectually rigorous and offers very rich theoretical insights, it doesn't quite provide, at least from my standpoint, doesn't quite provide sufficient historical context. And now I'm talking about the post-independence period, which is what I'm a student of. It doesn't quite provide a sufficient historical context and does not adequately address the lived realities and contemporary challenges faced by Indian universities. It tends to overextend theoretical interpretations, much of them derived from Western theories, and I'm not sure how relevant some of those Western theories are to our situation. So it tends to overextend theoretical interpretations into current educational policy, particularly of the present regime. Now, one of the book's most significant contributions is its analysis of public universities and the ongoing crisis of what he calls publicness, although I am also not quite able to fully understand the critique of publicness. But Debaditya critiques, I think, the subordination of Indian universities to what he calls audit cultures, NAC and NRIF, that is basically ranking systems, arguing that this shift has transformed knowledge into an academic, credit and commodified education. Now this, he contends, culminates, and that's the last chapter, which is actually a brilliant chapter, this, he contends, culminates in a platform-based structure reflective of the NEP model. Again, platform is something that I'd like him to explain a little more, because I understood it, and I must say that part I read 2 or 3 times to really get a grip of in the end I was able to understand it, but I'm not sure if I fully understood that. And following from that, I hope you will not mind this, I'm not sure if I fully share your critique of India's public universities. If we look at them historically over the last, since independence, over the last seven and a half decades, I'm not sure if I fully share your critique of public universities. That's probably because I have taught in a public university, and in a great public university for 40 years. And therefore, I think I am very biased towards public universities, and therefore, as I said, I was a little, what should I say? As I said, I didn't fully appreciate your very strong critique of public universities. And the reason I say that is because I think we cannot overlook the vital role of public universities in India, which offer access to higher education to large numbers of people from very diverse socio-economic backgrounds. And we must also not forget that none of the South Asian countries have really succeeded in establishing, the structure of higher education, the structure of public universities. In fact, I would extend it to the global South, really, that very few countries so early on were able to establish, this very ambitious system of public universities. And I think these institutions have significantly expanded enrollment, and through the implementation of reservations, as Tanika pointed out, they have transformed the class, caste, and gender composition of the student body as well as of the faculty. Today's campuses are far more heterogeneous and inclusive than they were a few decades ago. Public universities remain, and I want to underline this, public universities remain among the few spaces where individuals from all major social groups and backgrounds interact under relatively egalitarian conditions. So the universities are really, in that sense, a site of equality, if you will. Public universities, I certainly don't mean private universities. Now, the growing social diversity of universities, thanks to one of the world's most ambitious reservation or affirmative action programs that have been introduced in India, I think that has also enriched university life by introducing new perspectives and strands of thought within universities. Now, but that said, there is no denying, and I think Debaditya is quite right in pointing to or drawing our attention to the crisis that faces public universities, and they are facing a profound crisis. But contrary to what he suggests, I think the crisis does not arise from the inherent flaws in the Indian model of higher education or the Indian model of the public university, but rather from persistent political interference, chronic underfunding, and the systematic erosion of institutional autonomy. And I think the current government bears significant responsibility for this decline. Since 2014, when the present government gained, when the present ruling party gained a parliamentary majority, political encroachment into university governance has intensified. And this trend has accelerated since 2019, placing the Indian public universities in an increasingly precarious position. But the interesting thing is that parallel to this decline or deterioration in public universities is the rapid rise of private institutions or private universities, most of which focus narrowly on disciplines like engineering, medicine, and management. Today, as we know, nearly 60% of higher education institutions in India are privately operated. The more prestigious among them primarily serve a privileged demographic, often acting as gateways to postgraduate education abroad, essentially in the United States. Even the best of these institutions are predominantly teaching focused, catering mainly, that is the private universities, catering mainly to undergraduates, and they remain marginal players in the realm of research. And I think Debaditya makes a very nice and very important point about the overall decline in research enrollment in universities. And of course, he's talking about the decline in research enrollment, PhDs and so on, in public universities. But at the same time, we must remember that the majority of research activity and PhD activity remains concentrated in public universities and not in private universities. Now, this then brings me to two or three of his essential concerns, one of which is the new education policy, which, as he points out, marks a significant shift in higher education. Now, Debaditya offers a superb critique, actually, an outstanding critique of NEP. That's probably his strongest contribution. And although this NEP is framed in terms of flexibility and choice, it ultimately advances a model that is increasingly centralized, commodified, and ideologically driven. And I want to underline the last point. Now, Debaditya offers a compelling critique, as I just said, of NEP, arguing that it severs, and I think this is a really fascinating discussion which I found very attractive. He argues that that this NEP, and I must say I hadn't thought of it quite in that way until I read his critique of NEP. He makes the point that he argues that NEP severs the connection between education and meaningful employment. Now, one would have thought that education is a pathway to employment, but quite the opposite when it comes to NEP. So he argues that it severs the connection between education and meaningful employment, instead promoting a vision of students as multitasking workers, accumulating skills as marketable assets for a credit-based capital. Unsurprisingly then, the new education policy sidelines social sciences and humanities, effectively, as he says, delegitimizing critical forms of knowledge. It would have been much nicer if Debaditya had sort of discussed the neglect or the sidelining of social sciences and humanities a little more. Now, furthermore, and I think this is my main, one of my main points, I think he somewhat overlooks some key aspects of higher education, namely admissions, the curricula, and appointments, faculty appointments, that are increasingly being structured through a top-down approach, leaving little room for autonomy, and that most of these appointments are highly politicized. Now, this is not to say that appointments in the past, that is to say before this party came to power, that there was no political interference. There clearly was, but obviously much less than what is happening today. And while these appointments, as I said, while politicized appointments existed before 2014, earlier selections typically included at least some academic or professional standing. In contrast, I think the recent appointments increasingly prioritize ideological loyalty over academic merit. Moreover, I think this centralization and this complete sort of taking away of autonomy is not merely administrative. It is deeply political in both intent and execution. Take, for example, a 2022 directive from the University Grants Commission Secretary instructing universities and colleges to hold lectures on India, the mother of democracy, as part of the Constitution Day celebrations, an initiative that closely mirrored the Prime Minister's own international rhetoric, which he keeps repeating about India as the mother of democracy, notwithstanding what is happening to our democracy within the country. Such state-sponsored interventions, often cloaked in nationalist or civilizational discourse, form part of a broader ideological agenda. They aim to recast the university from a space of critical inquiry and intellectual freedom into one of ideological conformity aligned with a specific political vision. Now, the current trajectory of education, which of course he discusses, but I do have a point to pick on this. The current trajectory of education reflects a convergence between the interests of neoliberalism and Hindutva, both working to reshape the academic landscape in line with narrow political agendas. Now, this dual assault, economic and ideological, is unprecedented and profoundly destabilizing higher education in our country and the entire university system. Especially, and where I have to pick a point with him is that I think his focus is essentially on neoliberalism, and I'm completely within myself being a critic of neoliberalism. I appreciate that, but I'm equally a critic of majoritarianism, and I find that he doesn't pay sufficient attention. I mean, if you're talking about double assault, the double assault is both economic and ideological. It is, I said, neoliberal and majoritarian. And so I think majoritarianism has clearly expanded its influence in public universities over the past decade, and I think that Debaditya doesn't pay sufficient attention to that. Now, while it is true, and one could argue, that distortions in universities, public universities and higher education began under earlier Congress governments, but in recent years there has been a sharp acceleration resulting in transformative shifts across Indian universities. Now, the critical question, therefore, is when do these changes amount not merely to a difference in scale between then and now, but to a fundamental qualitative transformation in the structure of higher education. And I would argue that what we are witnessing in the past 11 years is a fundamental structural, political and qualitative transformation of the Indian university. And as I said, so therefore to keep harping कि ये तो पहले शुरू हुआ था, ये तो पहले के एजुकेशन मिनिस्टर ने किया था और फलाने वगैरह वगैरह वो किया था उन्होंने, मगर जो अब हो रहा है ये बिल्कुल ही मुख्तलिफ है, बिल्कुल ही अलग है, और हमारे ख्याल में हम लोग इनजस्टिस करेंगे अपनी हमारी जो पूरी हिस्ट्री है यूनिवर्सिटीज़ की, अगर हम इसको नहीं अप्रिशिएट करेंगे कि जो अब हो रहा है वो बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ है जो पहले हुआ था. But I think I just have two more points, and Debaditya's book, I think, engages with very pressing debates surrounding academic freedom, and he makes, I mean, he doesn't make the point directly, but it arises from his book that clearly, I don't know if he would agree with me, but I think universities have long been celebrated as testing grounds for society's collective values. Yet what we are witnessing today is a global decline in their role as centers of critical thought and critical inquiry. In the US, for instance, the pro-Palestine protests that were mentioned by Simon were met with severe crackdowns. Students were arrested, faculty were disciplined, and administrations bowed to pressure from state and private donors. In short, the underlying logic was disturbingly consistent across universities in the United States, not to the same extent in Europe, that dissent is inconvenient and critique is dangerous. Now, so clearly Now the same is happening to a great extent in India. But in India, this trend has taken on an even more alarming dimension, marked by a deeper erosion of the universities, public universities' foundational ethos, the freedom to question, to dissent, and to envision alternative futures. And this erosion in the universities, I think, reflects a broader, more troubling development, the steady shrinking of democratic space in India. And I just want to conclude with one very important point that, or issue that Debaditya raised in his introductory remarks, which was with regard to GER, or general enrollment rates. And I think that's a very, very important issue. And I think he made quite a dramatic point when he said that there is a critique that there are too many institutions. We need to cut down in institutions. Something like what is happening in the great state of Uttar Pradesh, where they're cutting down on schools and they're closing down schools. So this, what he said about university, that there are too many institutions and they need to be cut down, I think is something which is very important for us to remember and worry about. And I say worry about because the basic challenge of higher education in India is that we simply do not have enough quantity and quality of higher education. That's the basic issue. That is to say that access to quality education is still very limited, with a disproportionate number of public universities seats that are secured by a small group of students who succeed in the in the highly competitive class 12 examinations. For many others, the alternatives are either expensive private institutions, often of very questionable quality, or studying abroad, an option accessible only to the privileged few. This underscores a critical issue. India's gross enrollment ratio in higher education continues to lag behind regions like Europe or the United States. I mean, the gross enrollment ratio in India of the age group that should be in college or in university is still very, very low, or lower than not just European countries, but East Asian countries or China. So, and this is despite the considerable expansion of publicly funded higher education in India. So I think addressing this gap requires a substantial increase in both capacity and quality of public universities. And that is really the only way, because expanding access is not only essential for promoting equity and inclusivity that all of us are concerned about, but also for advancing broader development in India and the broader development of India's essentially fairly good higher education system. Thank you.
आप सबको बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया।